So I want to talk about the gap theory. Not just that it's wrong, but why it's wrong, because it has some important implications for things like sin and salvation. First of all, what is the gap theory? It's an attempt to insert the billions of years that false science requires in the middle of the first two verses of Genesis. The Bible reads like this, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Whereas the gap theory reads like this. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Then billions of years passed, the dinosaurs and other prehistoric creatures thrived, Lucifer fell, and a lot of crazy stuff happened. And the earth became without form and void. This is very bad doctrine that unfortunately, some people who seem to be otherwise good Christians, not just good Christians, but intelligent Christians, believe in. Alright, well, let's go over some of the problems with this theory. I think that one of the most significant problems with the gap theory is that Jesus puts the creation of Adam and Eve at the beginning, whereas the gap theory only puts the creation of the heavens and the earth at the beginning, and the creation of Adam and Eve millions of years later after the gap. Jesus said in Mark 10:6, From the beginning of creation God made them male and female, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife. This is a direct quote of Genesis 2:24, and it's specifically about Adam and Eve. So if Jesus places the creation of Adam at the beginning, I think that we should too.
Oh Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the works thy hand hath made, I see the stars, I hear the mighty thunder, thy path throughout the universe displayed.
Another big problem is Exodus 20:11, where it clearly says, in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth and all that in them is. And this was actually written by God himself on the tables of stone and handed to Moses. So I think he knows what he was talking about. This includes things like coal and oil formations that modern geology tells us takes millions of years. But just to challenge the notion that these things couldn't have happened quickly, look how fast these scientists are making oil in the lab nowadays.
And scientists from the US Department of Energy's Pacific Northwest National Laboratory have come up with a remarkable solution. Using a watery slurry of algae, they've discovered a way to efficiently, cheaply, and very quickly create crude oil. Algae fuel isn't a new idea, but it's been beset by problems in the past, namely that it's required to be dry before being processed, which is expensive and slow. The PNNL solution doesn't need it. The biomass can be up to 90% water and is dried as part of the process, heated and crushed under high pressure, as in a pressure cooker.
If you look at Exodus chapter 20, in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is. What is not included in that? It covers everything, doesn't it? Heaven, earth, sea, and everything in that. I can't think of anything outside of that. So the question is not, what does it say? It's obvious what it says. It says he made everything in 6 days. The question is, do you believe what it says? And those who teach there's a gap between verse 1 and verse 2 do not believe that verse. God wrote that phrase, Exodus 20:11, on a rock and handed it to Moses. Actually, Charlton Heston. And he said, in 6 days I made heaven and earth, and he rested the seventh day. I mean, it couldn't be more clear. God wrote on a rock with his finger. God said, I want you to honor the Sabbath because in 6 days I made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is. So the question is not, what does it say? Do you believe it? Was God lying? Was God confused? Did God not know about modern science proving the earth is millions of years old? Was God stupid? Is that the problem here?
Holy words long preserved for our walk in this world. They resound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart.
Another issue is the proper translation of the Hebrew. Genesis 1 verse 2 says, and the earth was without form and void. But people who believe the gap theory say it should be translated, but the earth became without form and void. But the people who translated the Bible are not as incompetent as the people who believe the gap theory would have you believe. And that's why no one translated it that way until the 1800s when the gap theory came out. But I'm not the best person to explain this issue, so let me just read from an article I read recently. Second. The Hebrew word, vav, usually translated and, is a simple conjunction. Gap theorists attempt to make it a word that indicates a strong contrast to that which was previously stated. It is merely the simple term for and. Vav is used thousands of times in the Old Testament without emphasizing anything important. To make it important in Genesis 1 verse 2 is inconsistent with its overall usage. A crucial doctrine should not be based upon this one word. Instead of but, the verse should be read something like, now the earth was. Consequently, there is no grammatical reason to have a break between the verses. Those who attempt to translate the verb haya, became in Genesis 1 verse 2, do so without much justification. The normal rendering of the word is was. Most scholars testify that the translation of became in this passage is doubtful, if not impossible, to uphold. Therefore, to base this theory on a suspect translation is wrong from the start. Another word that trips a lot of people up is the English word replenish, because in our modern usage it means to refill something that had previously been full and now was empty. But rest assured that in the 1600s, when the King James was written, it just meant to fill completely, and it comes from a Hebrew word that means to fill. Another verse that's a problem for people who believe the gap theory is Revelation 21:1, because it's clearly talking about the end of the world, and it calls the current earth that we're on the first earth. And that goes, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming from God out of heaven.
This is my Father's word, and to my listening ears, all nature sings, and round me rings the music of the spheres.
Another issue with the gap theorist's timeline is that if the rebellion of Lucifer happened before the 6 days of creation, God wouldn't look out on everything he created and proclaim it to be very good, as he does in Genesis 1:31. Lucifer, after all, is a created being.
The guilty pair bowed down with care. God gave his son to win his erring child. He reconciled and pardoned from his sin.
Another issue, and this is a big one because it has important theological implications, is that the Bible teaches consistently throughout that Adam is the one who brought sin and death into the world. But the gap theory has death long before Adam. Jesus came to save us from that sin and death, and I think we should be careful about teaching anything that casts doubt about the nature of sin and death as the Bible describes it, because we might have people doubting what they're actually saved from. Alright, well, I guess that's it for now. I'll just do some closing points and alliteration like a good preacher should. The gap theory is not relevant. The Bible doesn't teach it. In fact, the Bible contradicts it. It's recent. It's only been around since the 1800s. It's reactionary. It was only made in response to modern science's view on the age of the earth. And it's risky because it messes with the proper understanding of sin and death, and by extension, salvation. Alright, so I have some links below to other interesting videos to check out. Please like and subscribe, of course, and have a good day.